Welcome to the History Maps podcast. A United States Army colonel, backed by over 300 cavalrymen, seasoned indigenous scouts, and two mountain howitzers, finds himself completely pinned down in the dust of the Texas Panhandle.
Right, and he is forced to order this desperate retreat by an opposing force of roughly 5,000 indigenous warriors.
Yeah, and this was not the 1700s. This was late 1864. And the colonel ordering that retreat was Kit Carson.
It is a striking image. I mean, it completely upends that traditional narrative of westward expansion we usually get.
Oh, for sure.
We're often given this perception of a steady, inevitable march westward by American forces, a frontier line that just smoothly advanced year by year.
Right, but the reality on the ground in the 19th century Southwest was entirely different.
Utterly different, yeah.
And that is exactly what we are focusing on today. As part of our Native American series, we are taking a deep dive into the sources regarding the Texas Indian Wars.
Which is really a sequence of conflicts spanning roughly from 1820 to 1882.
Exactly. I mean, for anyone driving down an interstate highway in Texas right now or just looking at a modern map of the region, the borders look permanent, completely settled.
Right, but for over half a century, the Southern Plains were the site of a profound, multi-generational struggle for control.
Differing cultures, fiercely competing land claims, and rapidly evolving technology all collided in a way that truly defined the 19th century history of that region.
So to unpack this, we have to look at the shifting policies of the Spanish Empire, the Mexican government, the Republic of Texas, and finally the United States.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of that frontier line, the absolute dominance of the Comanche Nation, whose rise and eventual fall shaped the geopolitical reality of North America.
So to really grasp this, to understand how a completely different power structure operated on the plains, we have to look at the pre-colonial environment. I mean, Texas, long before European contact, developed as this crucial crossroads.
Yes, the geography dictated a great deal of the human history there. If you look at the map prior to European arrival, Texas sat right between several major cultural spheres of influence.
Right.
To the far west, you had the Pueblo cultures of the upper Rio Grande region, known for their settled agricultural societies and distinct architecture.
Over to the east, anchored along the Mississippi River Valley, you had the Mississippian culture, right?
Yeah, the great mound builders with their extensive trade networks. And reaching up from the south was the deep, lingering influence of Mesoamerican civilizations.
The sources actually mention places like Teotihuacan down in central Mexico, whose trade and cultural reach extended well into northern Mexico and peaked around the year 500.
Exactly. So the indigenous peoples living in the Texas region were already part of a dynamic, interconnected world.
They were navigating complex trade routes, exchanging goods, and competing for resources for centuries.
Right, this was not some empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a highly populated, politically active landscape.
And what stands out when reading the material is that the groups who eventually fought the hardest over Texas were all, well, relative newcomers.
Yes.
The Spanish only began permanently settling around the Rio Grande and pushing toward what is now San Antonio in the late 17th century.
And the Comanche, the group that would become the absolute lords of the plains, did not even arrive in northern Texas until the early 18th century.
Which is wild to think about. The origins of the Comanche are just crucial for understanding their later dominance.
Absolutely. Up until the mid-17th century, the people who would become the Comanche were actually part of the Shoshone.
Oh, right. Living far to the north.
Yeah, along the Upper Platte River in present-day Wyoming. And their lifestyle was exceptionally arduous. I mean, they were pedestrian hunter-gatherers.
Meaning they walked everywhere.
Exactly. They utilized dogs to pull small travois, which are those frame structures used to drag loads.
Yeah.
But, a dog can only pull so much weight. Therefore, their shelters had to be small, their positions few, and their hunting strategies relied on complex communal efforts, like driving buffalo off cliffs or into corrals.
Because a human simply cannot outrun a buffalo on the open plains.
Right. Their entire existence was strictly bound by human caloric output and walking speed.
So let us unpack this transition because the historical trajectory changes overnight. In the late 17th century, they acquire the horse.
Yes. These animals were trickling northward from Spanish settlements in New Mexico.
Especially after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, right? Which released thousands of Spanish horses onto the plains.
Exactly.
I was trying to conceptualize this shift while reading the sources. We could look at it like taking a modern infantry unit that has only ever marched through the mud with heavy packs and suddenly giving them a fleet of advanced aircraft.
That is a great way to look at it.
And not just giving them the machines, but them instantly developing the intuitive instinct to operate them perfectly. It is a staggering leap in mobility and lethality.
The logistical implications of that analogy are exactly right. I mean, consider what an aircraft requires. Vast amounts of specialized fuel, maintenance crews, and wide open spaces to operate.
Right.
The horse required the exact same logistical restructuring. The ancestors of the Comanche could not stay in the rocky, mountainous regions of Wyoming with large horse herds. Horses need immense quantities of grass and water.
So the technology essentially forced a migration.
Yes. To sustain the horses, they had to move to where the grass was plentiful. This sparked a southward migration away from the Shoshone, down into the southern Great Plains.
And they moved into this vast territory extending from the Arkansas River down into central Texas.
Which became the Comancheria. On horseback, their hunting radius expanded from a few miles a day to dozens of miles. They could track and run down buffalo with ease.
And more buffalo means a surplus of high-protein food. A surplus of food means the population can expand, the infant mortality rate drops, and, well, the physical stature of the people actually changes.
Precisely. They developed into a fully mounted, highly equipped culture. The horse changed their architecture. They could now drag large lodge poles, so their teepees became much larger.
It changed their economy, too, creating an immense trade network based on horses and buffalo robes.
And most significantly, it revolutionized their warfare. They developed superb light cavalry skills, basing their military doctrine on speed, stealth, and overwhelming localized violence.
They used this new mastery to violently clear the area of competitors. By the 1740s, the Comanche began crossing the Arkansas River in large numbers, establishing themselves on the Llano Estacado.
The high plains of Texas and New Mexico?
Yeah, and this region had previously been dominated by the Apaches.
The Apaches were formidable, but they had adapted to a semi-sedentary lifestyle, planting crops along river valleys for part of the year.
Which made them sitting ducks for the highly mobile Comanche.
Exactly. The Comanche engaged in a deliberate multi-decade campaign to drive the Apaches south and west, taking complete control of the best hunting grounds.
So they secured this enormous domain. They are the preeminent military power. But the sources highlight a severe, almost existential vulnerability.
Yes, they were devastated by unseen biological factors.
The biological reality of the North American frontier was utterly ruthless. European diseases, to which the indigenous populations had no natural immunity, swept across the plains along trade routes well ahead of actual European settlers.
The Comanches suffered from a catastrophic smallpox epidemic, stretching from 1780 to 1781.
Right.
And then, just as they were recovering, another severe smallpox outbreak hit during the winter of 1816 to 1817.
And the sources indicate that the best historical estimates suggest more than half of the total Comanche population perished in these two epidemics.
It was devastating. Entire bands were wiped out, the social fabric was torn apart, elders carrying cultural knowledge, skilled warriors, mothers, children, all lost in a matter of months.
This brings up a critical paradox. They suffer an unimaginable demographic collapse, losing 50% of their people. Yet, as we will see, they remain the dominant military force dictating terms across hundreds of miles of frontier.
Right.
How do they maintain that power with half their population gone? The material points to two specific strategies. First, they engage in high-level diplomacy. They form a lasting alliance with the Kiowa and the Kiowa Apache.
Which was a very pragmatic military decision. By allying with the Kiowa, they secured their northern border and added several thousand allied warriors to their overall strength, allowing them to pool resources to protect the buffalo herds.
But the second strategy is truly fascinating, and it speaks to the mechanics of their society. They systematically replenish their numbers by adopting captives.
It was a highly institutionalized practice. During their raids into Mexico, Texas, and against other indigenous tribes, they took thousands of captives.
Now, a significant number of these captives, particularly adult men, were killed or sold into a harsh system of slavery.
Yes, but a very specific demographic. Young children, generally under the age of 12, were adopted directly into the tribe.
And the demographic impact is staggering. The sources note that at certain periods, nearly 30% of the Comanche Nation was made up of individuals who were not born Comanche.
Right, they were ethnically Hispanic, Anglo, or from other native groups.
Which raises the question of integration. I mean, how does a society absorb that many outsiders speaking entirely different languages without losing its own cohesive identity?
It's a great question. If you take a child from a Spanish settlement in northern Mexico And a child from a frontier cabin in Texas. How do you turn them both into fiercely loyal Comanche warriors or mothers?
Exactly.
It comes down to total immersion and the stark realities of survival on the plains. When a child was adopted, the separation from their past was absolute.
They were given to a Comanche family.
Yes, often a family that had lost a child of their own, and they were raised exactly as a Comanche child. They were taught the language, the religious customs, and the essential skills of horsemanship and hunting.
There was no secondary status for them once adopted.
Exactly. The environment of the plains was too harsh for a caste system among the core members of the band. Absolute cooperation was required to survive the winters and hunt the buffalo.
Over time, the shared, intense experience of that life superseded their origins.
The Comanche were highly egalitarian and merit-based. If a captive boy grew up to be a brave warrior and a skilled horse thief, he could become a chief. His genetic background did not matter. His actions and his adherence to the Comanche way of life mattered entirely.
And the society they were integrating into was fiercely decentralized. We casually use the term Comanche nation, but that implies a centralized European-style state with a capital city, a king, and a parliament.
Right.
But the sources show they were divided into almost a dozen entirely autonomous main bands like the Penateca, the Yamparica, and the Quahati, and those bands were further broken down into dozens of smaller divisions.
They shared a common language, a common culture, and a common religion, but politically they operated completely independently.
A chief's authority only lasted as long as his followers believed he was successful, right?
Yes. If a chief made a poor decision, families would simply pack up their teepees in the middle of the night and join a different band.
Which created a nightmare for traditional European diplomacy. The Spanish, and later the Mexican and Texan governments, simply could not grasp this political structure.
You could see the friction constantly. A Spanish official in San Antonio would sit down with a chief of the Penateca band, negotiate a peace treaty, give out gifts, and send a letter to Mexico City saying, "We have achieved peace with the Comanche."
But that Penateca chief only spoke for his specific group of a few hundred people.
Exactly. The Yamparica band, living 200 miles to the north, felt zero obligation to honor a treaty they never signed, negotiated, or even heard about.
So a week later, a different band raids a settlement. The Spanish officials scream betrayal and tear up the treaty, while the Penateca chief is entirely confused as to why the Spanish are suddenly hostile to him.
It was a continuous cycle of frustration. The European concept of a singular sovereign authority dictating the actions of all its citizens simply did not exist on the plains.
This highly mobile, decentralized, horse-borne society created an absolute barrier. Spanish expansion pushing north from Mexico hit a solid wall.
They built presidios, they sent military expeditions, but they could not pierce the Comancheria.
Instead, the Comanche bypassed the forts entirely, launching deep, devastating raids far into the interior of Mexico to acquire horses and captives.
And this inability to secure the frontier leads to a desperate change in colonial strategy, bringing us into the 1820s.
Right. In 1821, the Spanish Empire collapses in North America, and Mexico gains its independence.
And the new Mexican government inherits a northern frontier that is an utter disaster. The province of Texas is drastically depopulated.
The missions are failing, the civilian settlements are huddled around a few fortified towns, and the Comanche raids are relentless.
The Mexican military cannot stop the light cavalry tactics of the Plains tribes, so they look for a solution outside their own borders.
They recognize that American frontiersmen pushing west from the United States are well-armed, land-hungry, and highly aggressive. So the Mexican policy becomes, let us invite these Americans to settle in Texas.
They authorize land grants to empresarios colonization agents like Stephen F. Austin. The deal was straightforward. Bring hundreds of American families, settle the land, become Catholic, swear loyalty to Mexico, and in return, you get vast tracts of prime real estate for pennies.
The unspoken part of the deal being, you also serve as a human buffer. You sit right on the edge of the Comancheria and take the brunt of the raids, insulating the interior Mexican settlements.
Exactly.
But we have to examine the logic here. I mean, does inviting heavily armed American militias to act as a defensive buffer not seem like a glaringly obvious risk to Mexico's own territorial sovereignty? You are handing the keys to your northern province to a foreign population that has clear, vocal expansionist desires.
It seems like a glaring error in hindsight, but we have to understand the sheer desperation in Mexico City at the time. They viewed the Comanche threat as an immediate bleeding crisis.
The raids were destroying the economy of the northern states.
Right. The American threat was viewed as a secondary long-term problem that they believed they could manage.
They thought assimilation would work.
Yes, they believed that by offering generous land grants, the Americans would become loyal Mexican citizens. It was a calculated risk born entirely of military impotence against the Plains tribes.
Now, the Mexican government did not rely solely on the human buffer. They also attempted diplomacy. In 1821, a man named Jose Francisco Ruiz negotiated a truce with the Pinatuca Comanche.
They even traveled to Mexico City to sign the treaty.
But the sources note that this peace collapsed within 12 months.
And it collapsed for a very specific reason. The Mexican government failed to deliver the promised gifts.
This goes back to the clash of worldviews. Explain the differing concepts of what a gift actually meant in these treaties.
To the Mexican government, and later to the Texans and the Americans, the gifts, blankets, knives, kettles, sugar, were viewed as temporary bribes. They were a sweetener to get the chiefs to sign a piece of paper.
Once the paper was signed, European diplomatic tradition dictated that peace was established by law.
Exactly. The gifts were viewed as an unsustainable expense that the Treasury could simply cut off once the ink was dry.
But the Comanche did not care about the paper.
Not at all. To the Comanche, the ongoing presentation of gifts was not a bribe. It was tribute. It was rent.
Because they controlled the land.
Right. And the Mexicans were asking for safe passage and the right to exist near the borders of the Comancheria. The gifts were the tangible proof of respect and the required payment for that peace.
When the tribute stopped arriving, the Comanche logically assumed the peace treaty was void and the raiding resumed immediately.
It is a fundamental misinterpretation of how power works. And when the raiding resumed, it hit the new American colonists hard.
By 1823, the situation was so dire that Stephen F. Austin realized his settlers needed a dedicated force to fight back. Regular, slow-moving armies with supply wagons could not catch the Comanche.
Austin needed men who could ride as well as the indigenous warriors, who could survive on the plains for weeks with only what they carried on their saddles and who were armed to the teeth.
He hired 10 men explicitly to act as a roving patrol.
This was the very beginning of the Texas Rangers, an irregular light cavalry force designed entirely to counter the specific threat of plains warfare.
They adopted many of the tactics of their adversaries. They learned to track, to endure extreme thirst and heat, and to launch rapid, violent surprise attacks.
But even with the early Rangers, the colonists were frequently overwhelmed by the sheer rapidity and scale of the Comanche advance. A defining moment that deeply scarred the psyche of the settlers was the Fort Parker raid.
This occurred on May 19, 1836. The Parker family and other colonists had constructed a heavily fortified blockhouse and stockade in Limestone County near the Navasota River.
They believed this fort was a safe haven.
But a large, multi-tribal war party consisting of Comanche, Kiowa, Wichita, and Delaware warriors approached the fort. The settlers, perhaps naively, allowed a few warriors to approach under a white flag to parley.
The warriors asked for beef and directions to a water source, but it was a tactical ruse to judge the fort's defenses.
Once they realized the main gate was open and many of the men were out working in the fields, the war party struck with overwhelming speed.
They overran the fort. They killed several of the militiamen, mutilated the bodies, and took 5 captives. Among those captives was a 9-year-old girl named Cynthia Ann Parker.
The Fort Parker raid sent shockwaves through the colonial settlements. The destruction of what was considered a strong fort proved that nowhere was truly safe.
And the capture of Cynthia Ann Parker would echo through Texas history for decades.
She was adopted into the Comanche tribe, exactly as we discussed earlier, and her life would become fundamentally intertwined with the end of the Comancheria.
We will definitely return to her story. But this raid happened right at the tail end of the Texas Revolution.
The human buffer strategy had failed Mexico spectacularly. The American colonists rebelled, defeated the Mexican army, and declared independence.
So now, the newly minted Republic of Texas had to deal with the Comancheria without any outside help.
The Republic of Texas was in an incredibly precarious position. They had no money, no standing army to speak of, and a tiny population. The best estimates suggest the Republic had roughly 30,000 Anglo-American and Hispanic residents at the time of independence.
And what was the estimated population of the Comanche and their Kiowa allies at this point, even after the devastating epidemics?
It was estimated to be somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000.
So it's essentially a demographic stalemate. You have 2 populations of roughly equal size, both heavily armed, both claiming the same vast stretches of land.
And how the Republic managed this stalemate depended entirely on the political philosophy of whoever held the presidency.
We see a period of extreme political whiplash between 1836 and 1845. The first president, Sam Houston, pursued a policy heavily focused on diplomacy, trade, and border demarcation.
Houston had a deeply unique background for a 19th century politician. Before coming to Texas, he had resigned the governorship of Tennessee and spent years living among the Cherokee Nation.
He was adopted by a Cherokee chief.
Right. He spoke the languages, he understood the political structures, and he respected indigenous cultures in a way very few of his contemporaries did.
Houston firmly believed that regular face-to-face diplomacy, establishing trading posts, and spending a few $1,000s a year on gifts and tribute was vastly superior, both morally and economically, to a ruinous frontier war.
He understood the concept of rent that the Plains tribes expected.
He immediately put this into practice. In 1836, he sat down with Chief Bowles of the Cherokee.
Now, the Cherokee were living in East Texas. They were an agrarian society, not nomadic Plains hunters.
Right. Houston signed a formal treaty granting the Cherokee title to the lands they occupied in East Texas, lands they had been promised by Mexican authorities for remaining neutral during the Texas Revolution.
To seal the treaty, Houston presented Chief Bowles with personal gifts: a red silk vest, a sash, and a ceremonial sword.
But Houston's diplomatic approach hit a brick wall in the Texas Senate. The Senate refused to ratify the treaty. They stalled it for a year, and then in December 1837, they outright nullified it.
Why? Because thousands of new Anglo-American settlers were pouring into Texas every month, and they wanted the rich timber and farming lands of East Texas.
They did not care about previous agreements or Houston's diplomatic vision. They demanded the removal of all native peoples.
And that aggressive, expansionist anger found its voice in the second president of the Republic, Mirabeau B. Lamar. Lamar takes office in late 1838, and his policy is the exact polar opposite of Houston's.
Lamar stated explicitly in his addresses to Congress that the white man, the red man, could not dwell in harmony.
Lamar's official policy was ethnic cleansing. He wanted to establish a permanent, secure frontier by forcefully expelling all indigenous tribes beyond the borders of the Republic.
And he decided to start with the easiest target, the Cherokee in East Texas.
Despite the fact that the Cherokee were peaceful farmers who had an unratified treaty, Lamar ordered the Texas militia to remove them. This sparks the Cherokee War in July 1839.
The Texas forces attacked the combined villages of the Cherokee, Delaware, and Shawnee. It was a brief but brutal campaign.
Around 100 Native Americans were killed in the fighting, and the rest were forced to flee north across the Red River into Indian Territory.
Among the dead on the battlefield was the elderly Chief Bowles. And the sources note a deeply poignant detail. When the militia found Chief Bowles' body, he was holding the ceremonial sword that Sam Houston had given him just 3 years earlier as a symbol of eternal peace.
It is a stark, tragic encapsulation of the sudden shift in Texas policy. Lamar's success in removing the agrarian tribes in the East emboldened him.
He believed he could use the exact same aggressive military force to pacify the Comancheria in the West.
But the Comanche were not farmers living in stationary villages. Invading the plains was a completely different logistical and military reality.
Lamar authorized the creation of a much larger regular army, spending vast sums of borrowed money. And this escalation leads directly to one of the most infamous and disastrous events in the history of the frontier, the Council House Fight of 1840.
To understand the Council House fight, we have to look at the pressure the Comanche were facing. In late 1839, a severe smallpox outbreak hit the plains again.
Simultaneously, the Comanche were fighting intense wars against the Cheyenne and Arapaho, who were pushing down from the north.
They're fighting a two-front war while dealing with disease.
Exactly. So, a faction of the Penitica Band, the southernmost Comanche, decided it was time to secure their southern border with Texas. They sent word that they wanted to negotiate a peace treaty and were willing to return captives to secure it.
The Texans agreed to a parley. In March 1840, 33 Penitica chiefs, accompanied by a large group of warriors, women, and children, ride into San Antonio.
They are directed to a one-story stone building called the Council House to conduct the negotiations.
The Texas officials, representing the Lamar administration, enter the room with a clear, non-negotiable demand. The Comanche must release all white captives immediately before any treaty can be discussed.
But the Comanche had only brought one captive with them, a teenage girl named Matilda Lockhart. She had been captured 2 years prior.
When the Texans saw her, they were horrified. Her face was severely scarred, her nose had been burned off down to the bone, and she was heavily bruised.
Matilda Lockhart informed the Texas officials that she had seen at least 15 other white captives at the main Comanche camp. She told them the chief's strategy. They planned to bring the captives in one by one to extort a higher ransom in horses and goods for each individual.
The Texans are absolutely enraged by her condition and by the extortion plan. 2 companies of Texas infantry are ordered to surround the council house.
The soldiers march right into the room with loaded muskets.
The lead Texas official turns to the interpreter and tells him to deliver a message to the 33 chiefs sitting on the floor. The message is, "You are all now hostages. You will be held under armed guard in this building until messengers are sent to your camps and every single white captive is delivered to San Antonio."
The interpreter, a man who actually understood Comanche culture, refuses at first. He says, "If I tell them this, they will fight."
The officials order him to translate it anyway. The interpreter delivers the message in Comanche and then immediately turns and sprints out the door of the building.
The reaction was instantaneous.
Let us pause here because I want to look at the mechanics of this decision. If the Lamar administration knew anything about the Comanche culture of warfare, how could they possibly expect this ambush to result in a peaceful surrender?
It demonstrates a willful, catastrophic ignorance. The Lamar administration projected European military logic onto an indigenous culture. In a European war, if an officer is surrounded by overwhelming force, the logical, honorable thing to do is surrender to preserve the lives of his men.
You become a prisoner of war.
But in Comanche culture, in Comanche society, a war chief derives his entire authority from his personal bravery and his physical autonomy. To be taken prisoner, especially through trickery during a diplomatic parley, was an absolute, unforgivable disgrace.
It was a fate literally worse than death.
The chief could not surrender under those conditions and maintain his honor or his soul.
So the moment they realize they are trapped, they react with desperate violence. The chiefs let out war whoops, they draw hunting knives from under their robes, they string their bows in the confined space.
One chief stabs a Texas soldier.
The soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder in the small stone room, level their muskets and open fire at point-blank range.
It is a slaughter. The room fills with black powder smoke. The fighting spills out into the courtyard and the streets of San Antonio.
The Comanche warriors outside, upon hearing the gunfire, start shooting arrows. The Texas militia and armed citizens open fire from the rooftops and windows.
When the smoke clears, 35 Comanches are dead. This includes all 33 of the Pennantecca chiefs, as well as several women and children who were killed in the chaotic crossfire in the streets.
7 Texans were killed and many more were wounded.
The Texans threw the bodies of the chiefs into a mass grave. They kept the surviving women and children as prisoners in a local jail, sending one widow back to the plains to demand the return of the white captives in exchange for the Comanche prisoners.
And this is where the cultural disconnect turns into a bloodbath. When the widow returned to the main camps and reported that 33 chiefs had been murdered under a flag of truce, the grief and rage within the Comanche nation was biblical.
Custom dictated that when a warrior was killed, captives belonging to his family must be sacrificed to accompany him to the afterlife.
Exactly. Upon hearing the news of the council house fight, the Comanche executed almost all of the remaining white captives they held. Some were tortured to death, others were killed quickly.
The Texans' attempt to forcefully rescue the captives resulted in their immediate execution.
But the retaliation did not end there. The Comanche intended to burn the Republic to the ground. A prominent war chief named Buffalo Hump sent messengers to every band across the plains.
He managed to unite roughly 500 warriors, an enormous force, and brought along hundreds of women and boys to handle the spare horses and the logistics of a massive plunder operation.
This was the beginning of the Great Raid of 1840. Buffalo Hump's army bypassed the frontier forts completely. They rode deep into the settled interior of Texas, sweeping all the way from the Edwards Plateau down to the coast of the Gulf of Mexico.
They hit the town of Victoria, killing citizens and stealing thousands of horses. And then they drove straight for Linville.
At the time, Linville was the second largest port in Texas. It was a major commercial hub where imported goods were stored.
The residents of Linville woke up to see a line of hundreds of Comanche warriors stretched across the horizon. The citizens had no time to mount a defense.
They ran for the docks, piled into rowboats and schooners, and paddled out into the shallow waters of the bay.
They literally had to sit in the water just out of Arrow Range and watch as the Comanche systematically looted the warehouses. They took bolts of cloth, umbrellas, hats, and tools.
They packed all these stolen goods onto thousands of captured mules, and then they burned the entire town of Linville to the ground.
As the immense raiding party slowly made its way back toward the plains, burdened by the huge herd of stolen livestock, the Texas Rangers and local militias finally caught up to them.
At the Battle of Plum Creek, the Texans managed to launch a surprise attack. They recovered much of the stolen loot and rescued a few captives, while killing several dozen warriors.
The Texans declared it a major victory.
But did it actually stop the threat?
No. The Great Raid proved definitively that Lamar's policy of aggressive intimidation had failed. He had not cowed the Comanche, he had enraged them.
They had proven they could strike the very heart of the Republic, burn a major port, and ride away with thousands of horses.
And the financial cost of Lamar's policy was the final nail in the coffin. The sources highlight a staggering economic reality. In the year 1840 alone, Lamar's administration spent $2.5 million fighting the Indian Wars.
To put that in perspective, that figure was significantly more than the total revenue collected by the Republic of Texas during Lamar's entire term in office.
He printed worthless paper money to fund the army, destroying the economy. He essentially bankrupted the young nation trying to enforce a military solution that the Republic simply lacked the manpower and resources to achieve.
The population was exhausted by the relentless bloodshed and the complete financial ruin, and this paved the way for Sam Houston to be elected to a second term as president.
Houston immediately dismantled Lamar's war machine. He disbanded the regular army to save money.
He relied strictly on a few small companies of Texas Rangers to patrol the border, and he issued strict orders. The Rangers were only to pursue and punish specific raiding parties.
They were explicitly forbidden from launching preemptive strikes or invading the Comanche area.
He pivots back to diplomacy, and remarkably, he manages to get Buffalo Hump, the very same chief who led the Great Raid and burned Linville, to sit down for a peace council.
It shows the pragmatism on both sides. The Comanche had suffered losses, trade had been disrupted, and Buffalo Hump recognized that a negotiated trade agreement was beneficial.
In 1844, they sign a treaty at Tawakana Creek. The Comanche agree to stop raiding the settlements and to return remaining captives.
In exchange, Texas agrees to establish official trading posts, provide regular gifts, and crucially, to officially recognize a boundary line for the Comanche area, prohibiting white settlement beyond it.
It was a monumental diplomatic achievement. However, the Texas legislature, reflecting the desires of the citizens, refused to ratify the provision that established a fixed boundary.
They wanted the option to expand westward.
So they strike the boundary line from the treaty.
Exactly. So the treaty brought a fragile, temporary halt to the major violence. But the fundamental underlying issue, who actually owned the land, remained completely unresolved.
Houston's fragile peace might have held if Texas had remained an isolated, bankrupt republic. But a geopolitical earthquake occurs in 1845. Texas is annexed and becomes a state within the United States.
And this merger creates a bureaucratic loophole that makes diplomacy literally impossible.
The entry of Texas into the Union fundamentally changed the balance of power. The United States federal government possessed the vast financial resources and the standing army required to realistically apply a policy of reservation confinement or removal.
But Texas statehood came with a highly unique, unprecedented condition. Unlike every other territory that transitioned into a state, places like Ohio or Illinois, the federal government did not take ownership of the unappropriated land.
Texas was allowed to retain complete control of all its public lands.
This created an immediate, paralyzing bureaucratic nightmare.
Let us expand on the corporate merger analogy we touched on earlier to really illustrate why this was so disastrous. Imagine a large corporate buyout. You have the federal government acting as the corporate headquarters.
Right. They hold the checkbook, and legally, under the U.S. Constitution, they're the only department authorized to negotiate contracts treaties with the Native American tribes.
But the state of Texas is a rogue department that owns all the physical office space, the land, and they absolutely refuse to give up a single square foot or hand over the keys.
That is the exact dynamic. Federal Indian agents were sent to Texas to establish peace. They knew from decades of experience that the only way to secure a lasting treaty with nomadic tribes was to guarantee them a specific, protected tract of land or reservation.
The agents sit down with the Comanche chiefs, and the chiefs say, okay, where is our land?
And the federal agents have to admit they have no land to give. They asked the Texas state government to allocate public land for a reservation, and the Texas legislature repeatedly refuses.
They view the land as their primary source of wealth, intended to be sold to settlers or given to railroads.
So the federal government is writing checks for peace, but Texas is changing the locks on the doors.
The disconnect between federal treaty obligations and Texas state land policies meant peace was unmappable. You cannot draw a boundary line if one side refuses to supply the paper.
With diplomacy structurally blocked, the violence naturally escalated again throughout the 1850s. American settlers, bolstered by the presence of federal cavalry forts, pushed aggressively westward directly into the Comancheria.
And the military response from the Texans evolved. Up until this point, most battles occurred when Comanche raiding parties attacked settlements and the Texas Rangers pursued them outward.
But in 1858, we see a major shift in tactics with the Antelope Hills expedition.
This expedition was led by Texas Ranger Captain John Salmon Ford, known as Rick Ford. Ford realized that chasing highly mobile warriors after a raid was inefficient. He advocated for taking the war directly to the Comanche logistical base.
Ford leads a combined force of Rangers and allied Tonkawa scouts across the Red River, venturing deep into the heart of the Comancheria, far beyond the line of white settlement.
They located a large Comanche winter encampment in the Antelope Hills near the Canadian River. Ford launched a surprise attack at dawn.
And they did not just engage the warriors. They attacked the infrastructure of the band. They burned the lodges, they destroyed the carefully curated winter food stores of dried buffalo meat, and they killed or captured the horse herds.
It was a profound psychological blow. It sent a clear message to the Comanche. The sheer distance of the plains will no longer protect you. You are no longer safe, even in the very center of your own territory.
And the violence on the frontier became deeply indiscriminate and racialized. The sources quote, Captain Ford brushing off accusations of killing non-combatants during these village raids by claiming it was difficult to distinguish warriors from women in the chaos of battle.
The prevailing attitude among the Rangers and the frontier settlers had hardened into an exterminationist mindset. Any indigenous person, regardless of age, sex, or tribal affiliation, was viewed as a hostile combatant.
This intense hatred extended even to white Americans who tried to protect the native populations. We see a stark example of this with the murder of Robert Neighbors in 1859.
Robert Neighbors was a federal Indian agent in Texas. He was one of the few officials who genuinely respected the tribes and understood their plight.
He spent years trying to maintain the few, tiny, state-allocated reserves that temporarily existed on the Brazos River, constantly putting himself between the tribes and angry mobs of white settlers who wanted to massacre them.
Neighbors eventually realizes that the political climate in Texas is so toxic that the Indians will never be safe within the state borders.
He coordinates with the federal army and physically escorts the peaceful reserve tribes north, marching them across the Red River into the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, to save their lives.
He successfully gets them to safety. But upon returning to a Texas frontier town on business, a white settler walks up behind him on the street and shoots him in the back with a shotgun.
The assassin did not even know Neighbors personally. Neighbors was murdered purely in retaliation for the crime of doing his job, for treating the indigenous people with humanity and protecting them from vigilante violence.
It is a dark testament to the animosity of the era. And the following year, 1860, brings another major turning point, highlighting both the indiscriminate violence and a deeply personal tragedy: the Battle of Pease River.
A ranger force, led by Lawrence Sullivan's Sul Ross, was tracking a Comanche band that had been raiding settlements. They located an encampment along the Pease River.
Now, there are conflicting historical accounts regarding the exact nature of this camp.
Yes, the official ranger report, followed by Sul Ross, frames it as a glorious military victory against a fortified warrior band.
But later Comanche accounts, notably from the descendants of those involved, state that the camp was primarily composed of women, children, and older men who were busy processing buffalo meat for the winter, while the majority of the warriors were away hunting.
Regardless of who was in the camp, the outcome was devastating. The Rangers attack with overwhelming force. They shoot down fleeing individuals, killing men, women, and children alike.
But during the pursuit, the Rangers surround one woman who is holding an infant. As they prepare to shoot her, they notice she has blue eyes.
He is Cynthia Ann Parker. 24 years after she was violently taken captive as a terrified 9-year-old girl during the Fort Parker raid, She is recaptured.
She is now 33 years old. She is the wife of a prominent Comanche war chief, Pita Nocona, and the mother of 3 Comanche children, including a young son named Quanah.
The Texans frame her recapture as a grand, heroic rescue. She is celebrated in the press. The state legislature votes to grant her a pension.
But for Cynthia Ann Parker, this was not a rescue. It was a second kidnapping.
Exactly. She had lived with the Comanche for 24 years. She had completely forgotten the English language. She considered herself entirely Comanche.
She was forcibly returned to an extended Anglo family she did not remember, separated from her husband, whom she believed was dead, and her 2 sons on the plains.
The sources describe her desperately trying to escape. She would steal horses and try to ride back to the Comancheria, but her white family kept her locked up or closely guarded.
After her infant daughter, who was captured with her, died of disease, Cynthia Ann simply gave up. She stopped eating and effectively starved herself to death out of grief.
Her story is an incredibly profound tragedy that perfectly encapsulates the tearing apart of lives on this violent fault line.
And just as her personal tragedy is unfolding, a vast national catastrophe erupts that completely upends the frontier dynamic. 1861, the outbreak of the American Civil War.
The Civil War created a sudden, immense power vacuum on the plains. The United States Army cavalry units, which had been manning the frontier forts and slowly squeezing the Comancheria, were ordered to abandon their posts and march east to fight for the Union.
Simultaneously, the state of Texas secedes. The experienced Texas Rangers, the men who actually knew how to fight the Plains tribes, enlist in the Confederate Army and are sent to battlefields in Virginia and Tennessee.
So the formidable military presence that had taken decades to establish vanishes almost overnight. The frontier is left guarded by poorly equipped, disorganized local militias consisting mostly of older men and young boys.
The Comanche and the Kiowa immediately recognize this weakness, and they absolutely seize the opportunity. They launch a coordinated, huge offensive to reclaim their lost territory.
They roll the frontier back.
Yeah.
Settlements that had taken 30 years of blood and sweat to establish are abandoned in a panic.
The line of white settlement in Texas is pushed eastward by over 100 miles. The western counties are depopulated, riddled with burned-out cabins and unharvested fields.
We see immense engagements during this period, demonstrating the renewed power of the tribes. For instance, the Elm Creek Raid in 1864, where an enormous war party devastated Young County, killing settlers and driving off thousands of head of cattle.
But the most significant demonstration of their military capability during the war years was the First Battle of Adobe Walls, also in late 1864.
This is the battle we mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive. Explain how Kit Carson found himself in this situation.
The Union Army commanding the Department of New Mexico was receiving reports of relentless Comanche and Kiowa attacks on supply wagons traveling the Santa Fe Trail. They decided they needed to send a punitive expedition to punish the tribes.
They choose Colonel Kit Carson, a legendary frontiersman who knew the plains well.
Carson marches into the Texas Panhandle with over 300 cavalrymen, 75 Ute and Chickarilla Apache scouts, and crucially, 2 12-pound mountain howitzers. He locates a large Kiowa village near the ruins of an old adobe trading post.
Carson attacks the village, driving the Kiowa out. He believes he has achieved a swift victory, but he makes a critical miscalculation.
He did not realize that the Kiowa village was just the vanguard. Stretched out along the Canadian River Valley for miles was an enormous combined winter encampment of Comanche and Kiowa bands.
The gunfire alerts the main camps, and suddenly Carson finds himself facing an overwhelming force. Somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 fully armed, mounted warriors arrive on the battlefield, led by the brilliant Kiowa chief, Dohazan.
They surround Carson's position at the Adobe Walls ruins. The indigenous warriors launch repeated, highly coordinated counterattacks. They use the tall prairie grass for cover, firing under the necks of their horses.
The only thing preventing Carson's entire command from being annihilated is the artillery. The explosive shells from the 2 howitzers keep the massed cavalry charges at bay.
By the late afternoon, Carson realizes his situation is untenable. He is running low on ammunition, his men are exhausted, and the enemy numbers are only increasing as more warriors arrive from distant camps.
He orders a fighting retreat, managing to burn the initial Kiowa village on his way out before marching his battered command back to New Mexico under the cover of darkness.
The Union Army officially categorized the expedition as a victory because Carson destroyed a village. But the tactical reality is undeniable. A fully equipped American military force, commanded by a legendary frontier officer, was decisively driven from the field by a vastly superior indigenous army.
Which brings us to a compelling demographic paradox. We established earlier that the Comanche population had suffered a catastrophic collapse due to disease, dropping from roughly 20,000 to perhaps under 8,000 individuals by the 1860s.
Right. So how does a population of roughly 8,000 men, women, and children dictate the terms of war across hundreds of miles of frontier, roll back the settlement line 100 miles, and field an army of thousands of warriors to defeat Kit Carson?
It speaks to the unique structural efficiency of their society. In a European or American nation, the military is a separate, specialized class. Only a small fraction of the total population serves in the standing army.
But in the Comanche Nation,
Every single able-bodied male from the age of 14 to 60 was a warrior. There was no distinction between a civilian male and a soldier.
therefore, an active population of 8,000 could realistically field a highly mobile cavalry force of 2,000 to 3,000 warriors within days.
They mobilized a vast percentage of their population. Furthermore, the withdrawal of federal troops meant the Comanche were no longer fighting a grueling war of attrition.
They were launching concentrated, rapid strikes against undefended targets, maximizing their localized numerical superiority.
But the Civil War ends in 1865, and a new economic reality takes hold in Texas that will fundamentally alter the conflict. We enter the era of the cattle boom.
During the 4 years of the war, while the ranchers were away fighting, the cattle herds in Texas were left untended. They multiplied exponentially in the brush country of South Texas. Millions of feral Texas longhorns were roaming the state.
Meanwhile, back east, the booming industrial cities are starved for meat. Beef becomes a highly valuable commodity. A steer that is worth $2 in Texas can be sold for $40 in Chicago.
This sparks the era of the Great Cattle Drives. Returning Confederate veterans, desperate for work, are hired as cowboys to round up these immense herds and drive them hundreds of miles north to the new railroad terminals in Kansas.
But the geography presents a major problem. The most direct and well-watered routes north, such as the Goodnight Loving Trail, cut straight through the western edge of the Comanche area.
And the Comanche did not simply ignore these herds of mobile wealth moving through their territory. The sources offer a really nuanced analysis of the economic dynamic here.
We tend to picture the Comanche just sweeping down, killing cowboys and stealing cattle out of sheer hostility. But the historical record reveals something much more sophisticated.
They were acting less as mindless raiders and more as aggressive border guards managing a sovereign territory. They recognized that a highly lucrative commercial commodity was being transported through their lands.
They essentially set up a toll system. The relationships were frequently transactional. The sources note that trail bosses were often permitted to cross the territory safely, provided they stopped and paid a negotiated toll and beef to the local Comanche band.
It was an extraction of resources from foreign commercial traffic, but when negotiations broke down or when a band was particularly hungry or hostile, that toll was extracted in blood.
We see a tragic example of this in the spring of 1867 involving the founders of the trail. Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving are driving a large herd. Loving rides ahead of the main herd to scout the route near the Pecos River.
He gets separated and is ambushed by a Comanche patrol of roughly 200 warriors. He is severely wounded, manages to hold them off from a riverbank for days, but eventually dies of gangrene from his wounds.
The threat to the cattle industry became existential. By the end of the 1860s, the relentless Comanche raids had effectively crippled the livestock business in West Texas, forcing ranchers to abandon immense tracts of grazing land.
But this economic disruption is exactly what seals their fate. By severely threatening the booming post-war cattle industry, which was vital to the economic reconstruction of Texas, the Comanche guaranteed that the full, undivided, and heavily armed attention of the United States military would return to the plains.
The U.S. military returns, but this time they bring a completely new doctrine.
We are moving into the final, brutal phase of the conflict, the era of total war, spanning from roughly 1871 to 1875. The catalyst for this final phase is an event known as the Warren Wagon Train Raid.
In May 1871, a large Kiowa war party, led by prominent chiefs Satanta, Satank, and Big Tree, ambushes a civilian freight wagon train hauling supplies in West Texas.
They kill and mutilate 7 teamsters, loot the wagons, and ride back to their reservation in Indian Territory. Now, raids on wagons were common. But what makes this specific raid a historical turning point is a matter of sheer coincidence.
General William Tecumseh Sherman, the commanding general of the entire United States Army, was conducting a personal inspection tour of the Texas frontier forts at that exact moment.
In fact, Sherman and his small cavalry escort had traveled down that exact same stretch of road just hours before the wagons were attacked.
The sources mention that a Kiowa shaman had experienced a vision before the ambush, prophesying that the first group of white men they saw would be a small party, but they should let them pass because a second, richer party carrying supplies would follow.
The warriors followed the prophecy. They watched Sherman's escort ride past from their hiding spots, choosing not to attack the most important military figure in the nation.
When Sherman arrives at Fort Richardson and learns that a wagon train was massacred on the very road he just traveled, he is furious. He realizes the defensive posture of the frontier forts is completely ineffective. He orders the immediate arrest of the Kiowa chiefs responsible.
Setanta, Satank, and Big Tree are arrested at Fort Sill. Satank is killed while trying to escape, but Setanta and Big Tree are transported back to Texas. And this leads to a highly unusual event.
They become the first Native American leaders tried in the United States civilian court for acts of war. The trial takes place in Jacksboro, Texas, and it becomes an absolute media circus.
Sherman wanted to use the civilian justice system to legally define the Native raids as simple acts of murder and robbery, stripping them of any military legitimacy.
But the spectacle backfired to a degree. It drew national and international attention. Setanta, known as a brilliant orator, gave a defiant speech to the court, famously warning that if they hanged him, it would start a terrible fire that would burn across the prairie.
The jury found them guilty and sentenced them to hang. But the governor of Texas, facing immense pressure from Eastern peace advocates and federal officials terrified of a huge uprising, commuted their sentences to life in prison.
While the legal maneuvers were unfolding, the military strategy was hardening permanently. General Sherman authorized Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie, commanding the 4th Cavalry, to implement a new approach to plains warfare.
Mackenzie realizes that chasing mounted Comanche warriors across the open summer plains is a fool's errand. They are too fast, they know the terrain better, and their horses are adapted to the heat.
So Mackenzie adopts and scales up the strategy first tested by John Ford at the Antelope Hills. The new doctrine is total environmental war.
You do not engage the warriors in a fair fight. You attack the ecosystem that sustains them.
The strategy was to mount winter campaigns. Wait until the weather is freezing, when the Comanche horses are weak from lack of grass, and the bands are huddled in deep canyons for shelter.
Then locate those hidden strongholds, attack relentlessly, burn the teepees, destroy the immense stores of dried buffalo meat, and above all, capture or kill the horse herds.
You destroy their means of survival, forcing them to choose between surrendering to the reservation or starving to death in the snow.
And this military strategy is occurring simultaneously with an even more devastating, unregulated civilian campaign: the industrial slaughter of the American bison.
This is a crucial element. The buffalo was the absolute center of the Comanche universe. It provided their food, their shelter, their clothing, and their trade goods.
In the early 1870s, commercial hide hunters, heavily armed with new, large-caliber long-range rifles, specifically the Sharps rifle, pour onto the plains. Let us examine the mechanics of this slaughter, because the technology is what makes it possible. Explain how a buffalo hunter operated compared to a Comanche hunter.
A Comanche hunter rode into the herd on a trained horse, shooting arrows at close range. It required immense skill and physical risk, and they generally only killed what they could process and use.
A commercial hide hunter, however, set up a stationary position, a stand hundreds of yards away downwind of the herd.
Using a rifle that fires a heavy lead slug with pinpoint accuracy over long distances, the heavy Sharps rifles could drop a buffalo at immense range without spooking the rest of the herd.
A single skilled hunter, backed by a team of skinners, could kill over 100 buffalo in a single afternoon.
They took only the hides, which were shipped east by rail to be turned into industrial machine belting, and left millions of pounds of meat to rot on the prairie.
The scale is almost incomprehensible. Within a few short years, millions of animals are eradicated. The Plains tribes watch in horror as their entire world, their entire grocery store and hardware store, is exterminated before their eyes.
Facing literal starvation and the collapse of their universe, the tribes attempt one final, desperate military defense. This leads to the Red River War of 1874, initiated by an attack on the buffalo hunters themselves.
In June 1874, a young, rising Comanche war chief helps organize a large coalition. That chief is Quanah Parker, the son of Cynthia Ann Parker. He manages to unite roughly 700 warriors from various Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne bands.
They target a small, isolated outpost of commercial buffalo hunters established at the ruins of Adobe Walls, the exact same site where Kit Carson had fought 10 years earlier. This is the Second Battle of Adobe Walls.
The warriors plan to hit the camp at dawn, hoping to catch the hunters sleeping and overwhelm them with sheer numbers.
But the element of surprise is ruined. A loud crack, possibly a breaking ridgepole in one of the buildings, woke the hunters early.
So when the 700 warriors charge, they are met by 28 buffalo hunters who are awake, barricaded behind thick sod walls, and armed with the most devastating long-range firearms on the continent.
The technological gap in this engagement was insurmountable. The warriors' bows and older muskets were useless against the fortified buildings. Meanwhile, the hunters used their heavy Sharps rifles to shoot horses and warriors at ranges exceeding 800 yards.
Quanah Parker's horse is shot out from under him, and he is wounded in the shoulder by a ricocheting bullet. Despite repeated, incredibly brave charges, the warriors cannot breach the buildings. They eventually abandon the siege.
The Second Battle of Adobe Walls was the last great coordinated attempt by the Allied tribes to defend the plains militarily. It proved that martial courage could no longer overcome industrial technology.
And while the hunters are destroying the buffalo, Mackenzie's cavalry is hunting the camps. This dual pressure culminates in the decisive blow of the Red River War, the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon in September 1874.
Mackenzie's 4th Cavalry and his Tonkawa scouts discover an enormous hidden encampment. 5 entire indigenous villages, Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne, are strung out along the floor of Palo Duro Canyon, a deep, jagged chasm cutting through the high plains.
Mackenzie achieves total surprise. He orders his troopers to dismount and lead their horses single file down the steep, treacherous switchback trails into the canyon at dawn.
The warriors realize the cavalry is descending and mount a frantic rearguard defense, firing from the rocks to buy time for the women, children, and elders to flee up the far sides of the canyon.
Because the people fled, the human casualty count in the battle is remarkably low. Only a few warriors are killed. But Mackenzie does not chase the fleeing people. He focuses entirely on his primary objective: logistics.
Mackenzie's troops spend the entire day systematically burning all 5 villages. They destroy hundreds of teepees, blankets, tools, and thousands of pounds of carefully stored winter meat.
And then they capture the combined horse herd of the 5 villages. Over 1,400 horses and mules.
Mackenzie knows from experience that he cannot try to herd 1,400 wild horses back to a fort. The Comanche are masters of horse theft. They would simply track the cavalry and steal the herd back under the cover of darkness.
So he makes a cold logistical decision. He allows his scouts to take a few hundred of the best ponies, and then he orders his men to march the remaining 1,000 horses into nearby Toole Canyon. He orders his troopers to form firing squads.
They systematically shoot over 1,000 horses. The pile of bones remained in that canyon for decades.
It is a staggering psychological and logistical blow. The bands that fled Palo Duro Canyon emerge onto the high plains just as winter is setting in.
They have no shelter, no winter clothing, no food, and almost no horses to hunt the rapidly vanishing buffalo.
The resistance completely collapses. Throughout the freezing winter and into the spring, starving, freezing bands slowly walk into the federal reservation at Fort Sill and surrender.
The final holdouts were the Gwahati Band, led by Quanah Parker. They managed to survive the winter on the Llano Estacado, but finally, recognizing that the old way of life was biologically impossible to maintain without the buffalo, Quanah leads his people into Fort Sill.
On June 2nd, 1875, Quanah Parker formally surrenders, marking the functional end of the Free Plains tribes.
It is a profoundly somber moment, but as we transition into analyzing the aftermath, we need to address a pushback on the traditional military narrative.
Yes, I want to challenge the way this victory is often framed. Was the United States Army's triumph actually a result of superior battlefield tactics? Or did they simply rely on ecological destruction, starving the Comanche out by killing the buffalo and the horses, rather than actually defeating them in open cavalry-to-cavalry combat?
It is a vital distinction to make. If we look strictly at mounted combat on the open plains, the Comanche remained a formidable, often superior tactical force to the very end.
The U.S. Army rarely, if ever, decisively defeated them in an open, fair fight.
The ultimate victory was achieved through a deliberate war of attrition aimed squarely at the environment. It was the systematic destruction of the resource base that forced the surrender. It was starvation by policy, enacted by both the military and civilian hunters.
Even after Quanah Parker surrendered, the frontier violence did not vanish instantly like flipping a switch. The sources note a few isolated skirmishes continuing past 1875.
Yes, the frontier was still a volatile place. You had conflicts like Victorio's War, involving Apache groups breaking out of reservations in 1880. There was a brief skirmish at Waco Tanks in 1881, and the McLaurin Massacre in 1881, which is generally considered the last fatal Indian raid in Texas.
But these were the final violent echoes of a conflict that had structurally ended. The Comancheria was gone.
When we look back at this complex half-century struggle, we tend to focus on the dramatic battles, the Rangers, the cavalry charges. But to truly synthesize the history, we have to acknowledge the true, overarching cause of defeat.
The demographic killer.
Exactly. Anthropologists and historians identify no fewer than 30 distinct epidemics, primarily smallpox, cholera, and measles, that struck the region between the 16th and 19th centuries.
The math is grim and unavoidable. These unseen diseases wiped out close to 95% of the indigenous population of Texas over those centuries.
The Comancheria was critically, fatally hollowed out from the inside, decades before Mackenzie ever marched his troops into Peladuro Canyon. The relentless warfare and the ecological destruction of the buffalo were the final, visible nails in the coffin. But disease had already emptied the landscape.
And alongside disease, there is the technological tipping point. We discussed how the horse revolutionized Comanche power, but industrial technology eventually caught up to and surpassed biological adaptation.
For decades, the Comanche absolutely dominated European and American forces because of the limitations of single-shot firearms.
Let us examine the mechanics of that. If a Spanish soldier or an early Texas Ranger is armed with a muzzle-loading musket, the reloading process is incredibly cumbersome.
You have to bite open a paper cartridge, pour powder down the barrel, ram a lead ball down with the rod, prime the pan, and cock the hammer.
Doing that while standing still takes 20 seconds. Doing that while bouncing on the back of a galloping horse is nearly impossible.
While the soldier is struggling to reload that one shot, a Comanche warrior, riding at full speed, can accurately fire a dozen arrows from underneath the neck of his horse using the animal's body as a shield. The Comanche essentially rendered single-shot weapons obsolete on the open plains.
But the tactical balance is permanently altered by the introduction of repeating firearms, specifically the revolver.
The sources point to pivotal early engagements, like the Battle of Bandera Pass in 1841, where Captain Jack Hayes and his Texas Rangers used Colt Patterson revolvers in combat for the first time.
The Patterson was a 5-shot revolver. It was fragile, it lacked a trigger guard, and you had to partially disassemble it to reload. But crucially, you could fire it 5 times with one hand while holding the reins of your horse with the other.
Suddenly, a small group of Rangers charging into a fight had the sustained, rapid firepower to match and suppress the volume of Comanche arrow fire.
It is fascinating to realize how the landscape and the adversary directly shaped the technology. The revolver was not just a neat invention that happened to find its way west.
The Texas Rangers specifically sought out and ordered the Colt revolvers, precisely because they desperately needed a weapon that functioned in the specific tactical environment created by Comanche light cavalry.
Samuel Colt's early company was actually failing until the Texas Rangers placed large orders and suggested design improvements based on their combat experience. The Comanche, through their military supremacy, literally forced the industrial development of the specific weapons that would eventually be used to defeat them.
It is a profound example of how intimately connected these adversaries were.
Yeah.
They did not just fight each other. They actively shaped each other's tactics, their economies, and their technological evolution through decades of violent, continuous exchange.
The borders between them were constantly bleeding into one another, culturally and literally, which leaves us with a compelling final thought to mull over. When we study this era, it is easy to view it as a simple binary conflict, a line on a map moving west. But the destinies of the people involved were inextricably intertwined. Look at the arc of the Parker family.
It is the defining narrative of the era.
Cynthia Ann Parker, a white settler child, is violently taken, completely assimilates, becomes a devoted Comanche mother, and is violently taken back by the society she was born into. Her son, Quanah Parker, fights the United States Army with incredible ferocity to the bitter end, yet after he surrenders, he completely reinvents himself.
He works tirelessly to help his people adapt to the reality of the reservation. He learns English, becomes a wealthy rancher, invests in railroads, and eventually becomes a political advocate and a personal friend to United States presidents like Theodore Roosevelt.
They live their entire lives exactly on the jagged, bleeding fault line of this conflict. And their story reminds us that the modern identity of Texas and the broader culture of the American West was not simply forged in heroic opposition to the Comanche. It was forged through a long, intimate, deeply tragic, and violently transformative exchange that permanently altered the culture of everyone involved.
The history is not a clean line. It is a shared, complex legacy.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.